The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Keda and Rantel. When Keda came back to her people, the cacti were dripping with the rain. The wind was westerly, and above the blurred outline of the twisted woods the sky was choked with crumpled rags. Keda stood for a moment and watched the dark rulers of the rain slanting steadily from the ragged edge of the clouds to the ragged edge of the woods. Behind the opaque formations the sun was hidden as it sank, so that but little light was reflected from the empty sky above her. This was the darkness she knew of. She breathed it in. It was the late autumn darkness of her memories. There was here no taint of those shadows which had oppressed her spirit within the walls of Gormenghast. Here, once again an outer dweller, she stretched her arms above her head in her liberation. "I am free," she said. "I am home again." But directly she had said these words she knew that it was not so. She was home, yes, among the dwellers where she was born. Here beside her, like an ancient friend, stood the gaunt cactus. But of the friends of her childhood who were left? Who was there to whom she could go? She did not ask for someone in whom she could confide. She only wished that she might go unhesitatingly to one who would ask no questions, and to whom she need not speak. Who was there? And against this question arose the answer which she feared. There were the two men. Suddenly the fear that had swept her died, and her heart leapt with inexplicable joy as the clouds above her in the sky had rolled away from their zenith. Those that had choked her heart broke apart and left her with an earthless elation and a courage that she could not understand. She walked on in the gathering dusk, and passing by the empty tables and benches that shone unnaturally in the darkness with the film of the rain still upon them, she came at last to the periphery of the mud dwellings. It seemed at first as though the narrow lanes were deserted. The mud dwellings, rising usually to a height of about 8 feet, faced each other across dark lanes like gullies, and all but met overhead. At this hour in the lanes it would have been pitch dark if it had not been for the dwellers' custom of hanging lamps above the doors of all their houses and lighting them at sunset. Keda had turned several corners before she came upon the first sign of life. A dwarf dog of that ubiquitous breed that was so often to be seen slinking along the mud lanes ran past Keda on little mangy legs, hugging the wall as he ran. She smiled a little. Since childhood she had been taught to despise these scavenging and stunted curs, but as she watched it slink past her she did not despise it, but in the sudden gladness that had filled her heart she knew of it only as a part of her own being, her all-embracing love and harmony. The dog urchin had stopped a few yards after passing her, and was sitting up on its mangy haunches and scratching with one of its hind legs at an itch beneath its ear. Keda felt her heart was breaking with a love so universal that it drew into its fiery atmosphere all things, because they were. The evil, the good, the rich, the poor, the ugly, the beautiful, and the scratching of this little yellowish hound. She knew these lanes so well that the darkness did not hinder her progress. The desertion of the mud lanes was, she knew, natural to that hour of the evening when the majority of the dwellers would be huddled over their root fires. It was for this reason that she had left the castle so late on her homeward journey. There was a custom among the dwellers that when passing each other at night they should move their heads into the light of the nearest door-lamp and then, as soon as they had observed one another, continue upon their journeys. There was no need for them to show any expression. The chances were that the mutual recognition of friends would be infrequent. The rivalry between the families and the various schools of carving was relentless and bitter, and it would often happen that the enemies would find each other's features in this way within a few feet of their own, lit by these hanging lamps. But this custom was rigorously observed. to stare for a moment and pass on. It had been Keda's hope that she would be able to reach her house, the house which was hers through the death of her old husband, without having to move into the lamplight and be recognized by a passing dweller, but now she did not mind. It seemed to her that the beauty that filled her was keener than the edge of a sword, and a surer protection against calumny and gossip, the jealousies and underground hatreds which she had once feared. What was it that had come over her, she wondered? A recklessness alien to the whole quietness of her nature startled but fascinated her. This, the very moment which she had anticipated, would fill her with anxiety when the problems to escape which she had taken refuge in the castle would lower themselves over her like an impenetrable fog and frighten her, was now an evening of leaves and flame, a night of ripples. She walked on. From behind the rough wooden doors of many of the dwellings she could hear the heavy voices of those within. She now came to the long lane that led directly up to the sheer outer wall of Gormenghast. This lane was a little broader than most, being about 9 feet wide and broadening at times to almost 12. It was the highway of the dwellers and the daily rendezvous for groups of the bright carvers. Old women and men would sit at the doors or hobble on their errands, and the children play in the dust in the shifting shadow of the great wall that edged by degrees along the street until by evening it had swallowed the long highway and the lamps were lit. Upon the flat roof of many of the dwellings a carving would be placed, and on evenings of sunset the easterly line of those wooden forms would smoulder and burn, and the westerly line against the sun in the sky would stand in jet-black silhouette, showing the sweeping outlines and the harsh angles which the dwellers delighted in contrasting. These carvings were now lost in the upper darkness above the door lamps, and Keda, remembering them as she walked, peered in vain for a glimpse of them against the sky. Her home did not lie in the highway, but at the corner of a little mud square where only the most venerable and revered of the bright carvers were permitted to settle. In the centre of this square stood the pride of the mud dwellers, a carving some 14 feet high, which had been hewn several hundred years before. It was the only one of that carver's works which the dwellers possessed, although several pieces from his hand were within the castle walls, in the hall of the bright carvings. There were diverse opinions as to who he may have been, but that he was the finest of all the carvers was never disputed. This work, which was repainted each year in its original colours, was of a horse and rider. Hugely stylized and very simple, the bulk of rhythmic wood dominated the dark square. The horse was of the purest grey, and its neck was flung backwards in a converse arch, so that its head faced the sky, and its coils of its white mane were gathered like frozen foam about the nape of its strained neck and over the knees of the rider, who sat draped in a black cape. On this cape were painted dark crimson stars. He was very upright, but his arms and hands, in contrast to the vitality of the grey and muscular neck of the horse, hung limply at his sides. His head was very sharply cut with the chisel, and was as white as the mane, only the lips and the hair relieving the death-like mask, the former a pale coral, and the latter a dark chestnut brown. Rebellious children were sometimes brought by their mothers to see this sinister figure, and were threatened with its disfavour should they continue in their wrongdoing. This carving had a terror for them, but to their parents it was a work of extraordinary vitality and beauty of form, and with a richness of mysterious mood, the power of which in a work was one of their criteria of excellence. This carving had come into Keda's mind as she approached that turning from the highway which led to the mud square, when she heard the sound of feet behind her. Ahead, the road lay silent, the door lamps lighting faintly small areas of the earth below them, but giving no intimation of any passing figure. Away to the left, beyond the mud square, the sudden barking of a dog sounded in her ears, and she became conscious of her own footsteps as she listened to those that were overtaking her. She was within a few yards of one of the door lamps, and knowing that were she to pass it before the approaching figure had done so, then both she and the unknown man would have to walk together in the darkness until the next lamp was reached, when the ritual of scanning each other's features would be observed. Keda slackened her pace so that the observance might be more rapidly disposed of, and the follower, whoever he was, might proceed on his way. She stopped as she came to the light, nor in doing so and waiting was there anything unusual, for such was the not infrequent habit of those who were nearing the lamps, and was, in fact, considered an act of politeness. She moved through the glow of the lamp, so that on turning about, the rays would illuminate her face, and the approaching figure would then both see her and be seen the more easily. In passing under the lamp, the light wavered on her dark brown hair, lighting its highest strands almost to the colour of barley, and her body, though full and rounded, was upright and lithe. And this evening, under the impact of her new emotion, had in it a buoyancy, an excitement, that through the eyes attacked the one who followed. The evening was electric and unreal, and yet perhaps, thought Keda, this is reality, and my past life has been a meaningless dream. She knew that the footsteps in the darkness, which are now only a few yards away, were a part of an evening she would not forget, and which she seemed to have enacted long ago, or had foreseen. She knew that when the footsteps ceased, and she turned to face the one who followed, she would find that he was Rantel, the more fiery, the more awkward of the two who loved her. She turned, and he was standing there. For a long time they stood. About them the impenetrable blackness of the night shut them in as though they were in a confined space, like a hall, with the lamp overhead. She smiled, her mature, compassionate lips hardly parting. Her eyes moved over his face, over the dark mop of his hair, his powerful jutting brow, and the shadow of his eyes that stared as though fixed in their sockets at her own. She saw his high cheekbones and the sides of his face that tapered to his chin. His mouth was drawn finely and his shoulders were powerful. Her breast rose and fell, and she was both weak and strong. She could feel the blood flowing within her, and she felt that she must die or break forth into leaves and flowers. It was not passion that she felt, not the passion of the body, though that was there, but rather an exultation, a reaching for life, for the whole of the life of which she was capable, and in that life which she but dimly divined was centred love, the love for a man. She was not in love with Rantel. She was in love with what he meant to her as someone she could love. He moved forward in the light, so that his face was darkened to her and only the top of his ruffled hair shone like wire. "Keda," he whispered. She took his hand. "I have come back." He felt her nearness. He held her shoulders in his hands. "You have come back," he said, as though repeating a lesson. "Oh, Keda, is this you? You went away. Every night I have watched for you." His hands shook on her shoulders. "You went away," he said. "You have followed me," said Keda. "Why did you not speak to me by the rocks?" "I wanted to," he said, "but I could not." "Oh, why not?" "We will move from the lamp, and then I will tell you," he said at last. "Where are we going?" "Where? To where should I go but to where I lived, to my house?" They walked slowly. "I will tell you," he said suddenly. "I followed you to know where you would go. When I knew it was not to Bregan, I overtook you." "To Bregan?" she said. "Oh, Rantel, you are still as unhappy." "I cannot alter, Keda. I cannot change." They had reached the square. "We have come here for nothing," said Rantel, coming to a halt in the darkness. "For nothing. Do you hear me, Keda? I must tell you now. Oh, it is bitterness to tell you." Nothing that he might say could stop a voice within her that kept crying, I am with you, Keda. I am life. I am life. Oh, Keda, Keda, I am with you. But her voice asked him as though something desperate from her real self was speaking. Why have you come for nothing? I followed you, and then I let you continue here with me, but your house, Keda, where your husband carved, has been taken from you. You can do nothing. When you left us, the ancients met, the old carvers, and they have given your house to one who is of their company. For they say that now that your husband is dead, you are not worthy to live in the square of the Black Rider. And my husband's carvings, said Keda, what has become of them? While she waited for him to answer, she heard his breathing quicken and could dimly see him dragging his forearm over his brow. I will tell you, he said. Oh, fire! Why was I so slow? So slow! While I was watching for you, watching from the rocks, as I have done every night since you left, Bragon broke into your house and found the ancients dividing up your own carvings amongst themselves. She will not come back, they said of you. She is worthless. The carvings will be left untended, they said, and the grain worm will attack them. But Bragon drew his knife and sent them into a room below the stairs and made 12 journeys and carried the carvings to his own house, where he has hidden them, he says, until you come. Keda, Keda, what can I do for you? Oh, Keda, what can I do? Hold me close to you, she said. Where is that music? In the silence they could hear the voice of an instrument. Keda! His arms were about her body and his face was deep in her hair. She could hear the beating of his heart, for her head was lying close to him. The music had suddenly ended and silence, as unbroken as the darkness about them, returned. Rantel spoke at last. I will not live until I take you, Keda. Then I will live. I am a sculptor. I will create a glory out of wood. I will hack for you a symbol of my love. It will curve in flight. It will leap. It shall be of crimson and have hands as tender as flowers and feet that merge into the roughness of earth, for it shall be its body that leaps. And it shall have eyes that see all things and be violet like the edge of the spring lightning. And upon the breast I shall carve your name. Keda, Keda, Keda. 3 times, for I am ill with love. She put up her hands and her cool fingers felt the bones of his brow and his high cheekbones, and came to his mouth where they touched his lips. After a little while Rantel said softly, You have been crying? With joy, she said. Keda, yes? Can you bear cruel news? Nothing can pain me any more, said Keda. I am no longer the one you knew. I am alive. The law that forced you in your marriage, Keda, may bind you again. There is another. I have been told he has been waiting for you, Keda, waiting for you to return. But I could slay him, Keda, if you wish. His body toughened in her arms, and his voice grew harsher. Shall I slay him? You shall not speak of death, said Keda. He shall not have me. Take me with you to your house. Keda heard her own voice sounding like that of another woman. It was so different and clear. Take me with you. He will not take me after we have loved. They have my house. Where else should I sleep tonight but with you? For I am happy for the first time. All things are clear to me. The right and the wrong. The true and the untrue. I have lost my fear. Are you afraid? I am not afraid, cried Rantel into the darkness. If we love one another. I love all, said Keda. Let us not talk. Dazed, he took her with him away from the square, and threading their way through the less frequented lanes, found themselves at last at the door of a dwelling at the base of the castle wall. The room they entered was cold, but within a minute Rantel had sent the light from an open fire on the hearth dancing across the walls. On the mud floor was the usual grass matting common to all the dwellings. Our youth will pass from us soon, said Keda, but we are young this moment, and tonight we are together. The bane of our people will fall on us, next year or the year after, but now, Rantel, it is now that fills us. How quickly you have made the fire! Oh, Rantel, how beautiful you have made it! Hold me again." As he held her, there was a tapping at the window. They did not move, but only listened as it increased until the coarse slab of glass sunk in the mud walls vibrated with an incessant drumming. The increasing volume of the sudden rain was joined by the first howls of a young wind. The hours moved on. On the low wooden boards, Rantel and Keda lay in the warmth of the fire, defenseless before each other's love.